The Bible is often seen primarily as a religious, ethical, or spiritual text, but at a deeper level, it encodes a critical and often overlooked insight about the evolution of moral authority and the foundations of stable social governance. From its earliest narratives of patriarchal rulers to the visionary ideals of a kingdom internalized within each heart, the biblical story does not merely teach personal morality. It systematically reveals how societies transition from hierarchical rule toward mature self-governance, from imposed obedience toward reasoned, contextual moral discernment. Central to uncovering this hidden social logic is recognizing that biblical narratives operate through carefully structured logical triads, sets of relational dependencies that consistently reveal deeper social meanings beneath their surface stories. Each biblical triad illuminates how moral legitimacy, the very justification for leadership, evolves from external commands and divine decrees toward internalized wisdom, individual integrity, communal participation, and ultimately towards self-rule, grounded in harmonized moral reasoning. Yet this progression is not linear or simplistic. Each triad also reveals its logical negations, showing explicitly how attempts to govern solely through external dominance or coercive submission inevitably produce instability, fragmentation, or moral disintegration. Thus, the biblical narratives collectively demonstrate that stable governance does not result simply from imposed power or rigid obedience, but emerges progressively from developing individuals' capacity to reason moral truth within context, as vividly illustrated through Jesus' parables. Today we demonstrate how the biblical accounts of leaders, from Abraham and Joseph through Moses, the judges, kings, prophets to Jesus, the church, and Revelation, are explicitly constructed to reflect evolving logical triads of moral authority. Each stage represents a distinct phase in the human shift away from rulers who dominate externally towards societies that sustain stability through internal moral coherence and self-governance. This exploration, therefore, is not simply about understanding biblical morality as individual ethics. It is explicitly a lesson about the governance of human societies, illustrating how genuine stability emerges from empowering individuals and communities towards self-rule. By interpreting the Bible through its deeper logical structure, revealed consistently by triadic analysis, we uncover its profound yet overlooked social teaching. Human governance matures when moral authority moves from external rulers into the hearts of the governed, enabling self-rule founded upon reasoned moral discernment. This is the hidden lesson of biblical leadership, and it is this lesson we unfold here. The first lesson the biblical text offers on leadership and moral authority is that social stability begins not with power or reason, but with trust in an external source. Leadership in this early form is not something achieved or reasoned into being. It is given, bestowed as a covenantal gift. The individual does not claim authority through merit, logic, or performance, but through willingness to submit to a relationship initiated by something beyond themselves. Abraham, the foundational figure of biblical faith, does not rise to prominence through wisdom or conquest. He is chosen. God calls him out from his homeland with a promise, one that is vague in its details but absolute in its intention. I will make you a great nation and you will be a blessing. Genesis 12:2. Abraham's role is not to create the blessing, but to believe in its possibility. His leadership is rooted in faith, not in plan or persuasion. This pattern reveals the triad of causal authority. Faith leads to favor, and favor leads to fruitfulness. Abraham's faith, his trust in the promise, initiates a flow of moral legitimacy. He receives favor from God, and that favor begins to manifest in social fruitfulness, land, descendants, and influence. Leadership in this structure flows from an act of trust in the unseen, and its legitimacy is externally validated by outcomes that fulfill divine promises. The authority does not reside in Abraham himself. It flows through him, conditional on his continued faithfulness to the external source. When that trust is disrupted, as in moments of fear or deception, the pattern temporarily breaks, but the covenant remains, emphasizing again that authority originates outside and must be continuously trusted into being. This is the logic of early hierarchical societies, where legitimacy flows from the top down, often sanctioned by the divine. It parallels the structure of ancient monarchies, priest-kings, and even early legal codes, where obedience to the sacred or the sovereign was the bedrock of social order. The community's stability depends not on each person's moral reasoning, but on collective adherence to an external authority figure who is believed to be in alignment with a divine or cosmic order. This model provides cohesion, especially in small or emerging societies, but it also embeds fragility. Should the appointed leader fail to hear or represent that divine authority faithfully, the entire system is at risk of collapse. The biblical narrative presents this not as a flaw, but as a foundational stage. It introduces moral authority as a form of sacred trust, necessary in a world not yet ready for more complex forms of moral reasoning. But in doing so, it also sets the stage for the need to internalize what was once external, to reason through what was once simply received. The triadic lesson prepares us to ask, what happens when the divine voice is no longer so directly heard? What if leadership must emerge in the absence of a clear covenantal claim? What happens when authority must be discovered rather than bestowed? The next phase in the biblical logic of leadership reveals that authority does not always come as a gift. It can emerge from within, through consistent moral integrity under pressure. The lesson here is that legitimate leadership can be discovered, not merely appointed, and that authority grounded in inner character can manifest in time, even when not initially recognized. Joseph's story stands in sharp contrast to that of the patriarchs. He is not the recipient of a divine covenant. He receives dreams but no command. He is sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in prison. His path is anything but direct. Yet through each hardship, he holds to a consistent moral compass. He resists temptation, tells the truth, works faithfully in obscurity. It is only over time and in response to his unwavering integrity that Joseph's authority is elevated. Pharaoh sees in him something rare: wisdom, discernment, the Spirit of God. What began as hidden character is eventually revealed as public legitimacy. This reflects a non-linear triadic pattern. Integrity leads to elevation, which leads to deliverance. The path is not causal in the same sense as Abraham's. It cannot be predicted or systematized. Joseph does not control his ascent. His leadership is the product of inner formation, not external confirmation. Yet once revealed, it becomes indispensable. His ability to foresee crisis and steward resources saves not only Egypt, but also the family through whom the covenant will continue. This triad introduces a new principle. Authority may not be seen immediately, but it can emerge through sustained moral coherence. In social terms, Joseph represents a movement toward meritocracy and institutional trust. His legitimacy comes not from inheritance or divine appointment, but from competence and resilience. This mirrors historical moments where societies began to shift toward leadership based on ability rather than bloodline, where bureaucratic order and administrative wisdom began to replace priestly or kingly right. We see echoes of this in early republics, later in Enlightenment rationalism, and in systems of governance that prize law, expertise, and character over charismatic or hereditary rule. Yet Joseph's story also reminds us that even this model depends on recognition by those in power. Without Pharaoh's trust, Joseph's gifts would remain buried. Authority grounded in integrity still requires social acknowledgement. The system is more mature than the patriarchal model, but not yet self-sustaining. It leans heavily on the perception of legitimacy by others, which introduces the risk of misrecognition or suppression. Still, this stage marks a profound shift. Leadership no longer depends on covenantal election, but on discernible internal moral consistency. It opens the door to reasoned judgment, to character formation, to a form of legitimacy that grows in hiddenness and is revealed through outcome. It begins the movement away from externally controlled systems of dominance and into a model where individuals, shaped by moral integrity, can begin to hold the weight of social trust, even in the absence of divine appointment. It prepares us for a future in which authority can emerge from the bottom up, shaped by wisdom and perseverance rather than command. The third lesson the biblical narrative reveals is that as societies grow in size and complexity, moral authority must become structured, codified, and publicly accessible. Trust alone is no longer sufficient to sustain collective coherence. There must be a shared reference point that mediates between divine will and human action. Moses embodies this transitional figure, not as a king or patriarch, but as a mediator between the divine and the people, bringing into existence a legal structure that both expresses and constrains moral authority. His leadership is inseparable from the giving of the law at Sinai, a dramatic public event in which the divine will is revealed not to a single individual but to the entire nation, and then entrusted to Moses to interpret and implement. Unlike Abraham, Moses does not lead by personal faith alone, and unlike Joseph, his authority is not revealed through outcome. It is mediated through law received from outside but entrusted to be interpreted and enacted through human agency. This reflects the conjoined triadic logic. God's word, Moses' mediation, and the community's obedience together establish legitimate leadership. None of these elements can stand alone. God's law without Moses is unstructured. Moses without divine law is illegitimate. The community without both is unstable. The system only works when all three are aligned. This represents a major development in social governance, the birth of legal authority. It parallels the formation of early legal codes such as Hammurabi's, but with a key difference. The Mosaic law is relational and covenantal, not merely procedural. Its legitimacy is not just in its function, but in its moral grounding. It provides the first full model of rule by law rather than by person, yet it is still rooted in divine command. The people are expected to submit, not because of the charisma of a leader, but because the law reflects a just and sacred order. The emphasis begins to shift from who leads to how leadership is exercised, through alignment with a revealed structure of moral reality. However, this model also shows its limits. Moses must constantly intervene, interpret, and even negotiate with God on behalf of the people. The law exists, but the people struggle to internalize it. Authority is still largely external. Obedience is expected, but understanding is limited. This creates a precarious reliance on intermediaries. When Moses is absent, the people revert to idolatry. When interpretation is unclear, rebellion follows. Still, this stage marks a monumental advancement. It introduces the idea that societies can be governed not by personality but by principle. It lays the groundwork for all subsequent systems of jurisprudence and constitutional governance. The rule of law becomes a vessel for moral authority, imperfect but more stable than charisma or lineage alone. And yet, because the law remains externally imposed, its legitimacy remains vulnerable. The next lesson will show what happens when no structure holds authority together, and society must rely only on leaders raised up in the moment. The judges illustrate leadership arising from immediate necessity amid institutional collapse, characterized by charismatic authority dependent solely on effectiveness in crises. Without embedded law or stable institutions, leaders like Deborah or Gideon gain legitimacy through direct, spirit-empowered actions. This creates alternating reinforcement, with obedience leading to unity and feedback, with disobedience leading to fragmentation, triads, demonstrating the volatile and unsustainable nature of charismatic rule. The judge's narrative critiques this instability and implicitly argues the necessity of institutional governance, setting a desire for enduring structures of legitimacy and preparing the way for a kingship grounded in sustained internal and external coherence. The rise of kingship in Israel marks a pivotal moment in the biblical evolution of moral authority. The desire for stable, centralized governance confronts the challenge of sustaining legitimacy over time. The people's demand for a king in 1 Samuel 8 reveals their fear of instability and their longing for order. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations. What they ask for is not simply a ruler, but an institutional anchor. The era of charismatic judges has proven too volatile. Law exists but lacks enforcement. Community identity is fragile. The people believe that a king, enduring, visible, accountable, will resolve this. But what unfolds instead is a threefold experiment in institutional rule. Saul, David, and Solomon each embody a distinct model of kingship, and together they illustrate the promises and failures of moral authority grounded in institutional power. Saul begins the monarchy as a chosen figure, appointed by divine command, anointed by the prophet Samuel, and embraced by the people. His authority is unquestionable in its origin, but fragile in its substance. Saul's leadership reveals the flaw in assuming that external appointment is sufficient for enduring legitimacy. He disobeys divine instruction, acts presumptuously, and fails to develop the internal character necessary to sustain his role. The triadic logic here is reversional. Disobedience leads to loss of favor, which leads to collapse of legitimacy. Saul's fall demonstrates that institutional authority, even when divinely initiated, is reversible if not undergirded by internal moral coherence. The external structure cannot substitute for internal alignment. David represents a new balance, a more stable configuration of moral authority that combines divine appointment with sincere heart alignment. Though he is also chosen and anointed, his legitimacy grows through struggle, patience, and humility. Unlike Saul, David does not seize power prematurely. He waits, suffers, and cultivates a deep reliance on God. When he sins, he repents. When he rules, he seeks justice. This introduces a triadic structure of coexistence: God to king to people. Each relationship mutually sustains the others. Divine favor depends on the king's heart. The king's legitimacy depends on the people's trust. The people's well-being depends on God's continued presence. David's reign is not without failure, but his model of kingship marks a turning point. Authority is now partly relational. It exists not only because of a title, but because of a lived integrity that holds all three relationships in dynamic balance. Solomon builds on this, but shifts the moral foundation once again from relational trust to internalized wisdom. His reign begins with an explicit request, not for wealth or victory, but for discernment. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, 1 Kings 3:9. In this, Solomon introduces a form of leadership based on integration. Wisdom leads to just governance, which leads to prosperity and peace. His triad reflects a mature form of authority, one that internalizes the role of judgment and aligns it with divine intention. For a time, the system works. Solomon's wisdom becomes legendary, his kingdom flourishes, and the temple becomes the physical and spiritual center of national life. But this form of authority is more vulnerable than it seems, because it depends on internal coherence. When the heart strays, the entire system begins to unravel. Solomon's accumulation of power, wealth, and foreign alliances erodes the very wisdom on which his legitimacy depends. The triad shifts from integration to disintegration. Loss of moral clarity leads to spiritual compromise, which leads to national fracture. After his death, the kingdom splits. This illustrates the risk of advanced systems of governance. The more authority is entrusted to the internal discernment of the leader, the more catastrophic the effects when that discernment is corrupted. Together, the stories of Saul, David, and Solomon show how institutional authority must evolve to include internal moral formation. A king may be appointed, but he must also cultivate wisdom. He may rule, but he must also serve. He may enact law, but he must also embody its spirit. The broader lesson is that institutional stability alone does not guarantee moral legitimacy. Without alignment between external structure and internal integrity, systems decay. This pattern repeats in the rise and fall of empires and in modern statecraft. Charismatic revolutions give way to institutions, institutions decay without reform, and moral authority must eventually be recovered from within. This stage marks a high point in the biblical arc. It suggests that governance must not only be structured but morally intelligent, guided by discernment, responsive to context, and accountable to both divine intention and human community. And yet it also signals the fragility of such systems when wisdom becomes detached from humility. The king who asks for understanding becomes the cautionary tale of unchecked accumulation. Authority, even in its most refined form, must remain rooted in a moral center, or it will collapse under the weight of its own success. This prepares us for the next phase, in which institutional failure gives way to prophetic voice and the burden of moral authority shifts once more, this time into conscience. The prophetic tradition introduces a striking lesson in the evolution of moral authority. When systems become corrupt and institutions lose legitimacy, moral leadership must arise from conscience, often at great personal cost. The prophets do not lead armies, build temples, or hold office. They speak, and in doing so they reveal that moral authority can no longer be sustained merely by status, structure, or even wisdom alone. Instead, it must come from an uncompromising internal alignment with divine justice, an alignment so strong that it compels speech regardless of consequence. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and others confront kings, priests, and people alike, not with institutional power, but with moral clarity rooted in revelation and ethical conviction. The prophetic triad is one of combination, internal truth combined with external critique. Their legitimacy lies in the fusion of personal moral burden and public moral confrontation. They are not merely dissenters or rebels. They speak from within the tradition they critique. Jeremiah, a priest's son, weeps over the people he condemns. Isaiah speaks of both judgment and restoration. This combination grants their voices weight. They are not above or outside the system, but deeply embedded within it, calling it back to its purpose. The triad functions when conscience and tradition align, issuing a critique that seeks not destruction but renewal. Yet it is a precarious authority. Prophets are often rejected, persecuted, or ignored. Their legitimacy is almost always denied by the powerful in their own time, but in the biblical arc it is their vision that proves enduring. In social governance terms, the prophets represent the rise of moral protest as a necessary response to institutional decay. They anticipate every later movement in which internal conscience must speak against systemic injustice. Socrates, the Hebrew martyrs, Jesus, and modern whistleblowers all follow this logic. The prophetic role is essential in moments when formal structures no longer function as they should, and when the law, once sacred, is wielded for the benefit of the powerful. The prophetic model teaches that moral authority can and must arise from conviction rooted in a deeper truth, even when unsupported by structure or consensus. This is also the stage where the Bible sharpens its critical view of external religion divorced from justice. I hate your festivals, but let justice roll down like waters. Amos 5:21-24. It reveals a negative counterpart to the earlier legal triads. When obedience becomes ritualistic and disconnected from ethical purpose, it becomes a perversion rather than a fulfillment of divine intent. The prophets are living rejections of false legitimacy and living embodiments of a deeper kind of truth. But their model, though powerful, is also isolating. The voice of conscience is essential, but it cannot govern alone. It can deconstruct, but it cannot rebuild. The prophetic triad destabilizes corrupt systems, but it leaves open the question of how to construct moral legitimacy again once the old order has been discredited. The next stage attempts to answer that question by returning to law, but in a new form, one that emerges not from decree, but from shared collective ownership. The return from exile offers a sobering and instructive lesson. After institutional collapse, after prophetic critique has exposed deep corruption, the only path to restored moral authority is collective participation in shared truth. Ezra and Nehemiah do not come with miracles, nor do they speak with the disruptive fire of the prophets. Instead, they lead by rebuilding physically, socially, and spiritually. Their leadership reveals that when moral authority is lost, it must be reconstituted not by power or charisma, but by community consensus and renewed engagement with foundational principles. The triadic pattern here is inclusive. Teaching leads to order, which leads to restoration. Ezra reads the Torah aloud in public, and the people weep, not because they are being threatened, but because they understand. This moment is critical. The law is no longer imposed from above or enforced by fear. It is rediscovered, reinterpreted, and voluntarily embraced. The people themselves enter into covenant again, not by command, but through mutual recognition of its necessity. Nehemiah, meanwhile, organizes the rebuilding of the wall, a project that is both practical and symbolic. It represents the restoration of shared identity, protection, and dignity. This phase introduces a form of governance based on distributed responsibility. Authority now flows through collective understanding. Leaders still facilitate, but they do not dictate. Moral legitimacy depends on a triadic convergence of clarity, teaching, structure, social order, and buy-in, communal restoration. It reflects a maturing political insight that law without participation is brittle and participation without structure is chaotic. Lasting moral authority requires both a shared ethical foundation and a people willing to internalize and uphold it together. Historically, this stage parallels the emergence of constitutional cultures, the development of civic education, and the formation of systems that rely on shared values and participatory governance. Like post-exilic Jerusalem, societies rebuilding after collapse often turn to founding documents, shared rituals, and educational renewal to re-anchor legitimacy. But the success of such efforts hinges not on the brilliance of the law itself, but on the community's engagement with it. Ezra and Nehemiah do not reinvent the law, they reawaken a people to its meaning. Their success is not in novelty, but in reappropriation. This marks a key moment in the arc of governance, the recognition that moral authority must be collectively sustained. It cannot rest on individual charisma or even divine revelation alone. It must be internalized by a people. Authority becomes inclusive. This anticipates and sets the stage for the transformative turn that will follow, the shift from external law and collective responsibility toward the possibility of full internalization, a kingdom within, discerned not by institution or tradition alone, but by moral alignment of the heart. The life and teaching of Jesus mark the decisive turning point in the biblical story of moral authority. It is here that all previous models, covenantal gift, legal structure, charismatic necessity, prophetic critique, communal participation, are not discarded but transformed. Jesus announces that he has not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. In this he speaks not only of continuity, but of completion and internalization. What was once external, revealed, mediated, imposed, is now to be written on the heart. What was once partial and fragmented is now integrated into a single moral center, grounded not in institutional enforcement, but in relational alignment with the divine will. The authority of Jesus is unlike anything that came before. He does not derive it from office, tradition, or institutional sanction, nor does he claim it through prophetic protest or popular revolt. His authority emerges from harmonic coherence. His actions, words, inner life, and divine mission are in perfect alignment. This is the logic of the triad of harmony. The inner heart, the outer action, and the divine intention are not merely consistent, they are mutually revealing. When Jesus teaches, his hearers say he teaches as one who has authority, not because he appeals to a text or a priesthood, but because he embodies the truth he proclaims. This fulfillment is deeply moral, not merely doctrinal. The Sermon on the Mount reinterprets the law, not by negating its demands, but by drawing them inward. You have heard it said, but I say to you. Each phrase intensifies the ethical call, not by making it more rigid, but by making it more real. Anger is as serious as murder, lust as soul-shaping as adultery. The law remains, but its jurisdiction shifts from external behavior to internal intention. Jesus does not weaken the law, he roots it in the heart, where it becomes not only something to obey, but something to become. This new moral center makes leadership profoundly different. It is no longer about commanding others, but about embodying the kingdom. Jesus leads by becoming the very pattern of the life he invites others into, serving, healing, forgiving, suffering. His leadership is not coercive, but transformative. Those who follow him do not simply comply, they are changed. And the change begins with a moral recognition. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Authority in this system is now measured by coherence and love. It is universally accessible but deeply demanding because it calls not for obedience to a rule but for alignment with a person who reveals the heart of God. In social governance terms, this is a revolution. Jesus redefines the foundations of moral legitimacy. Not lineage, law, wisdom, or tradition, but the capacity of the individual to perceive and respond to moral truth from within. It anticipates every form of nonviolent resistance, every democratic insistence on conscience, every movement rooted in justice and love rather than power and fear. And yet Jesus does not abandon community or structure. He forms a fellowship, teaches patterns of reconciliation, and establishes rhythms of shared life. But these are no longer grounded in control, they are expressions of inward transformation. The kingdom, he announces, is not out there, but within you. This is what it means to fulfill the law and the prophets. Jesus does not negate what came before, he draws it to its intended end. The covenant becomes a universal invitation. The law becomes wisdom written on the heart. The prophet's fire becomes the Spirit's presence. and leadership becomes a call to become what we once only followed, agents of reconciliation, reflections of divine love, bearers of moral clarity, not imposed, but discerned and lived. This stage marks the critical moment in the arc of moral authority. For the first time, self-rule becomes possible, not as rebellion but as alignment. The divine does not disappear from governance, it moves inward. And this sets the stage for a radically new community, where each person can become a participant in shared moral discernment, where the law is no longer over the people, but among and within them, and where the final authority is not control, but love made visible. The formation of the early church reveals the next essential step in the evolution of moral authority. Internalized discernment, once embodied uniquely in Jesus, becomes distributed across a community, guided not by law or hierarchy, but by the Spirit. The lesson here is that a stable moral society does not require a singular ruler or rigid institution, but a people whose shared life is shaped by mutual discernment, truthfulness, and love. The church begins not with a constitution, but with a shared experience, Pentecost. In that moment, the Spirit that empowered Jesus is poured out upon all, dissolving distinctions of status, gender, ethnicity, and office. Authority is no longer centered in a temple or throne. It becomes immanent among the people themselves, discerned in truth, confirmed by love, and sustained through community. This stage follows a convergent triad. Truth, Spirit, and community come together to form moral discernment. None can function in isolation. The Spirit without truth leads to chaos. Truth without Spirit becomes rigid legalism. Community without either dissolves into tribalism or control. But when these elements converge, they form a resilient moral system, adaptive, self-correcting, and centered not in domination but in mutual transformation. In Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council demonstrates this logic. Faced with unprecedented questions about law, culture, and inclusion, the leaders do not appeal to precedent or command. Instead, they discern together, "It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us," a formula that captures the balance between divine guidance and human judgment. The epistles further develop this participatory ethic. Paul speaks of the body as many members with different gifts, all contributing to a shared moral life. He appeals not to coercion but to conscience. And let each be fully convinced in their own mind, Romans 14:5. Moral authority in this system is shared, dialogical, and relational. It is held together not by uniformity but by fidelity to truth, mutual respect, and the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on. Leadership exists, apostles, elders, teachers, but it is grounded in service and tempered by community feedback. Authority is no longer vertical, it is relational and reciprocal. In terms of social governance, this marks a profound shift from rule over others to collaborative moral reasoning. It anticipates the logic of deliberative democracy, non-hierarchical consensus models, and covenantal political theory. It reflects historical shifts towards systems that depend not on the rule of law alone, but on informed, morally responsible citizens. This system is deeply resilient because it is not top-heavy. If one member fails, the body can adapt. If disagreement arises, it is addressed not through silencing, but through discernment. The community does not abandon structure, but its structure is shaped by its spirit. Yet this model also demands maturity. It cannot be sustained without humility, patience, and the active pursuit of unity. Paul's letters reveal the tension. Communities are fragile, disagreements real, and the temptation to fall back into hierarchy or legalism always present. But the direction is clear. Moral authority belongs to the community as a whole, so long as it remains rooted in spirit and truth. This stage fulfills Jesus' promise that the kingdom is within us, not as isolated individuals, but as a people called into covenantal, transformative life together. This prepares us for the final vision, when the inward moral transformation and the communal ethic of the church are fully vindicated, not just in this world, but in the unveiling of the world to come. The final lesson comes not in the form of law, leader, or institution, but in a vision. Revelation reveals that the entire arc of moral authority, from covenantal gift to inner transformation, does not end in individual enlightenment or social equilibrium alone, but in cosmic vindication. The story concludes with a confrontation between the forces of domination and the witnesses of truth, between the empire of coercive control and the community shaped by sacrificial love. The triumph is not of violence over violence, but of faithfulness through suffering, culminating in a kingdom not imposed from above but revealed from within, the New Jerusalem descending as a city prepared like a bride. Here, moral authority reaches its eschatological form. The Lamb who reigns does so because he was slain. The leaders who overcome do so not through power, but by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Revelation 12:11. This is the triad of association, faithfulness, suffering, and vindication. Authority in this vision is not claimed, it is revealed through endurance. Those who suffer for truth become the very foundation of the new order. The throne is not a symbol of force, but of moral clarity that endures every trial and remains steadfast. This vision is not abstract. It completes the biblical critique of worldly power. Systems built on domination, deception, and fear are shown to be unsustainable. Babylon falls, the beast is judged. What remains are those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. A people whose inner alignment with love, justice, and truth is made visible in the life of the world to come. This final vision shows that true authority cannot be imposed. It must be revealed through faithfulness and received through transformation. As a model of social governance, this is radically hopeful. It tells us that no system built on fear or control will endure, and that every act of moral clarity, however hidden or costly, participates in a larger story of redemption. It affirms that the arc of history does bend toward justice, but only through the endurance of those who live in alignment with love. This stage gives voice to the deepest human hope, that a world ordered by moral truth, freely embraced and faithfully lived, is not only possible but ultimate. In this final movement, we see not just the possibility of self-rule, but the consummation of moral authority in the union of divine presence and human maturity. The city has no temple, for its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. No mediation, no external law, no ruler above. All things are fulfilled. The light shines from within. The biblical story of leadership and moral authority is not a cycle destined to repeat itself, nor a theory to admire from a distance. It is a lesson, a trajectory toward freedom, responsibility, and moral self-rule. And like all hard-won wisdom, it can be lost. If misunderstood or misused, the very structures designed to cultivate moral autonomy can become tools of regression, even oppression. This too, the Bible anticipates. Not every generation carries the arc forward. Again and again, history shows what happens when people look backwards, seizing on an earlier, simpler stage of moral logic, mistaking clarity for truth and obedience for virtue. It is easy to romanticize covenantal beginnings, to long for strong rulers, to return to external law. These stages are comprehensible. They offer security, structure, even identity, but they are not the destination. They were necessary beginnings, not final forms. To elevate them as the goal is to reverse the moral current of the biblical narrative, to treat fulfillment as betrayal and maturity as disobedience. And when that reversal happens, when people willingly hand back their autonomy for the comfort of command or the illusion of order, the consequences are devastating. From inquisitions to fascist regimes, from cults of personality to religious authoritarianism, the worst atrocities of history have not come from freedom run wild, but from freedom abdicated. It is tempting to blame systems, ideologies, or social forces, but that misses the deeper truth the biblical arc insists on. Only the individual can assert moral agency. No ruler, law, tradition, or movement can do it for them. Even in the most advanced communal structures, the church, the vision of the New Jerusalem, the burden remains personal. The kingdom may be among us, but it is also within. Self-rule is not granted, it must be chosen, sustained, and lived. The Bible does not leave us with naive optimism, it ends with a call. Let the one who is thirsty come. It assumes that not all will. The freedom it offers is real, but so is the risk. The progress of moral authority toward discernment, alignment, and inner transformation is always fragile. It can be undermined in an instant and must be renewed every generation. What Scripture ultimately teaches us is that moral authority, once external and imposed, is now internal and embodied. But this gift is also a demand. It calls every individual and every community to take responsibility, not just for what is believed, but for what is lived. This is the promise and the peril of self-rule. It is the end of domination and the beginning of accountability. Let us not forget it.